Hello, hello. Let me make sure we got the right microphone on. The correct one. That's not what I meant to do. Sound. Alright, we got her. We Gucci. Let me know if there's any audio or visual problems, folks. Friends and family. Comrades and comradettes. I don't know. Woo! Haircut looking sharp. Thank you. Eddie has arrived with his guitar, definitely. Eddie, you should look up what modern chad means, because you are one. I almost said modern Chad. Modern Chad, okay. What's that? I'll look it up another time. I can't reach my keyboard right now. We're waiting on Carlos. I don't know what's taking that man so long. He told me he'd be ready in 5, like 15 minutes ago. I'm seeing Red Hot Chili Peppers in August. Sweet. You should look it up. I will. Hello, Comrade Eddie. I forgot to ask in the last stream, how do I send your old viral TikTok of Jordan Belfort to you? Send it to midwesternmarks@gmail.com. That's the easiest way to, if you, I can't promise I'm gonna get it if you send an or if you send a message to us anywhere else. But if you send something to Midwestern Marks, the email, midwesternmarks@gmail.com, Carlos will get it or I will get it for sure. So. That's all I know of that song, but I learned it today. Getting better at it. I heard that word on Ownage Pranks. What's Ownage Pranks? Is that a prank show? Carlos! There we go. What's up?
What's up, brother? How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, good, good. I'm excited to chat.
Me too. I've been reading a bunch. The other day, I realized I had like 6 or so books saved up that I hadn't even talked about on
Mm.
stream or anything. So I just rattled on about them for a while. But um, it'll be nice to uh, talk with someone or talk with you about some of those books. And then I've been diving into Hegel. Um, and I know you've been reading some new stuff too. And I've also been reading. I just finished Mao's quotations, and you've been reading some about China. So hopefully we'll have a lot to talk about today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Um, I've been, as you know, excited to hear how your Hegel adventure has been going. Um, there's an American philosopher, a quite prominent one, William James. He's one of the key pragmatist figures, along with Peirce and Dewey. And he hated Hegel, man. He was the one that hated Hegel the most. Person was okay with Hegel, and Dewey had a Hegel face early on, but James fucking hated Hegel. And one of the biggest attacks on Hegel was when he tried um, hallucinogenic drugs. And he's like, oh, after I was really fucked up, that's when I started being able to understand Hegel, which is such a like it's such a like an undergrad thing to say, right?
That
But
is it's like not just an undergrad thing to say because it's goofy and doesn't make that much sense, but an undergrad thing to say because that's like when you're more likely to be trying hallucinogenic drugs, and you're
yeah,
also like learning at a higher level for the first time, so some people are like, this LSD is making me smart. It's making me a genius. I just need to
yeah,
take more. Now I'll understand Hegel. If I take LSD and then sleep on my Hegel book, I'll absorb all the information.
yeah. You start to get into some of the shelling trends of intuitions. If you just get high and sleep on the book, it just hits you automatically. Um, yeah, that's funny. James ended up being the one of the advisors to W.E.B. Du Bois in Harvard. And politically, he was fairly progressive. He was part of the Anti-Imperialist League, which at that time it doesn't really signify much. I think Andrew Carnegie, was a part of it too. But either way, he was fairly progressive. He's in the sort of progressive camp in the history of U.S. thought. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Maybe we should write about him for our next Journal of American Socialist Studies.
He's interesting. I've written about Dewey, and I have a couple articles that I'm waiting to hear back from scholarly journals about Dewey. Uh, what's interesting with Dewey is that he never understood Marx, but then developed a theory of knowledge that was very similar to the Marxist one, that emphasizes the unity of theory and praxis quite well. And then politically, he was very critical of American democracy, thought it was a sham, and that if you were serious about democracy, you should think about it as a way of life. And so I would see him as a sort of Richard Wolff type socialist, as someone who would like to expand democracy into these other institutions, definitely into economics. And he would see that as reciprocally enriching the at least formal democratic institutions that we have. So he was part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, though,
Hmm.
um, especially early on. I don't know if he was conscious of the forces behind it. I know some people like Bertrand Russell was a part of it at first, and then he left once he realized that he was really being used as a tool by imperialist forces. Um, I don't know if Dewey left or if he just died or what happened there, but yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to see who got caught up in that, and like, I don't know. I guess if you're wary of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and just CIA operations in general within the left and um, their using of what's the tactic called? Controlled opposition. Once you're aware of it, I guess it can be easy to lump together anyone who was attached to a group like the Congress for Cultural Freedom or a CIF effort like that. But we don't know what groups are controlled opposition today, but we know that some voices in some groups definitely are. So there may be people who are controlled opposition who we've accidentally connected ourselves to, especially, early on when we were just getting our footing. So yeah,
Right.
it's easy to look when you're looking historically to make moral judgments, without knowing the specific context.
Yes, and it's the sphere of influence that it has is so big that it gets to a point where it doesn't even have to directly materially influence spokesmen, because it's just so hegemonized in the culture that people just start popping up, and they materially represent this interest, this compatible left, this controlled opposition, or what Parenti would call an ABS left, and anything but socialism left. But
Or
they'll do it
ABC, anything but class.
or anything but class, yeah. But they'll do it more spontaneously just because of the influence that these projects have had culturally and in the places of knowledge production. Which, I mean, there's a phenomenal essay that just came out. We shared it on Twitter by Gabriel Rockhill in the Philosophical Salon that ties the Frankfurt School to the CIA. He's also had articles before on the French thinkers and specifically Foucault, where he just destroys it. But it's insane. I mean, you open up. I did it yesterday because I have the older copies. I opened up One Dimensional Man and Soviet Marxism, which are two texts that I've like reread 3 times. And in the acknowledgement page, which is something we don't usually read, one of the last things he acknowledges that he thanks is the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of the oldest capitalist gangsters there is, right? Um, so not to like shit completely on what they say, but you have to question what are the material incentives behind it. And one of the things that Rockhill does nicely in that article is show how the editorial policy and what was allowed to be said and what wasn't allowed to be said was largely controlled by who was funding it. And a lot of the times it was not just the State Department, but major capitalist firms. There was an instance that I recall. And I hope that we can have at some point a conversation with Rockhill about this. But there was an instance with Habermas, who submitted 2 articles, and Horkheimer rejected them because he said something along the lines of um, about, something along the lines of like revolution is possible and the existing order that we live in is like not good, and he rejected them. And in a letter to Adorno, he's like, how can we talk about the horridness of the existing order when it's the one funding us? So it's just insane, man.
That is crazy. I want to ask you, well, somebody had a question about the Nordic countries and socialism. I can write that down so we can get to it later. But someone asked me yesterday how this is on my mind because I've been watching a bunch of Roe v. Wade videos today as I was watching the news, because that's most of what people are talking about. But someone asked me what the best way to organize around Roe v. Wade is, or where your efforts should be focused, and how much energy should you actually expend, should Marxists expend organizing around that. Obviously, all the parties in the U.S., as you would expect from them, through their full support behind the Roe v. Wade protests and mobilizing around them. But the criticism is obviously that the Democrats' polling is really, really low, and now they're going to try and mobilize voters around this, when the Democrats are, of course, not the answer. The Democrats are, part of the reason rights are being stripped. They're not going to actually fight to reinstate rights. In fact, they like that this fight is going on right now because it'll give them a chance in the upcoming elections. So, yeah, what do you think the strategy should be for socialists and Marxists, though? I gave my answer, but I don't know how good or how thorough of an answer it was. So we'll get the other co-editor of Midwestern Marx.
Well, I think it's simple. Is just look at what the position of socialist countries historically has been. The USSR was the first one to bring forth the right to abortion. Cuba has free abortions. Most of the socialist countries have the same policies with respects to abortion, with the exception of maybe some socialist projects that have had to make compromises with the quite strong Christian forces in their countries. It's been very clear that socialists are on the side of a woman's right to choose. There's also just the fact that, like, banning abortions isn't banning abortions. It's banning safe abortions, right? Women are still going to have abortions, but they're going to have them in more dangerous conditions that can be detrimental to their health, and specifically working class women. So it's like abortion's not going to stop. I don't know what these people think. Abortions aren't going to stop. They're just going to get more unsafe, and we should try to prevent that in any way possible. But I think it's a working class issue. It's an issue of that concerns just how like half of the working class is women, and it concerns their ability to decide what to do with their body. We know that capitalism needs workers in order to produce surplus value, and those workers need to be made, and they're made by women. So um, banning the ability to have abortions is perpetuating conditions so that women are forced to produce uh, beings that end up being converted into embodiments for the potential to realize surplus value and to profit for capitalists. And that's conjoined with a situation where I think you've dealt with it quite nicely in describing how it is that American capitalism specifically uh, creates conditions which are just horrible for trying to create a family. There's no maternal or paternal leave. Daycare is not guaranteed. Some of the basic things that you need in order to have a flourishing family, a family that's comfortable economically, you don't have in the U.S. And so you create conditions where it's absolutely, where it's incredibly difficult to have a family, and then you force people into keeping a kid. It's just, um, it's these contradictions that are expressed by capital, and I think that there's always a way to tie it back to capitalism. And Lenin is very clear about this in his fights against the trend known as economism, which really just tried to focus only on things concerning the labor movement, and it also came coupled with a fetishism of spontaneity, and an attack on any sort of ideological work and education of the working class. But part of the critique that Lenin makes of economism in classical texts, such as What Is to Be Done, is that it fails to see how these other movements, like the student movements and these different movements, and we can add in our context the movement for free and safe abortions, or the movement in favor of sustaining Roe v. Wade and codifying it. It fails to see how these are great places to bring up the property question and to talk about socialism and to talk about why it is in the interest of capital to have these rulings that shoved people into the street. It's very comfortable to stay at home and not rock the boat. So when we see people in motion, we know that something seriously went on, that a nodal point was passed, and that they got off their couch to do something, which means that we should be paying attention and always bringing up the systemic roots of the issue. I think that's the case with protests like the Black Lives Matter protests, and it's definitely the case with the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, I would agree. There, even if the protests, similar to what we were saying about the Freedom Convoy protests, with them being organized by right wingers, but even if these protests are organized by establishment Democrats, and they're trying to filter people into the Democratic Party, you can still go and talk to working people there and say, well, the U.S. also is one of the only countries who doesn't have paid maternity leave by law. So, um, you'd think if they're going to force women to carry babies to term, at the very least, we would allow women to stay home with the baby and take care of them once it's born. But we don't do that. We throw them back into the workforce so they can continually be exploited. And then, of course, as Kristen Godsey points out in her book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, it's then harder for women to climb the career ladder because they are expected to do all the domestic work and take care of a kid, and they, you know, have to take time off for pregnancy. So, yeah, there's all sorts of ways that the market or our capitalist system super exploits women or makes life harder on women, and this is just one of them, or another one that has to be looked at through that class lens, I think, while also understanding too, like, I see someone pointing out Nicaragua. Like, Nicaragua is still a socialist country, just because their people, are mostly anti-abortion. Like, that's the democratic decision there, I guess. So that doesn't mean we should support imperialism against them, because that's a way that liberal imperialists are going to try and use this issue, I'm sure. They still deserve self-determination and sovereignty, but that doesn't mean that we have to abandon the fight here at home, or, not go to these protests and raise the property question. I see some people kind of seemingly saying that, like, look, Nicaragua doesn't have abortion, so we shouldn't go to these protests. It's like, well, as Carlos said, most other socialist countries have, and have
that's the
expanded
switch.
healthcare access, so expanded access to abortion.
That's a very it's also one of the compromises that the Sandinista revolution sort of had to make with the church in the process of coming back into power in that second revolution. So if you just point at it without looking at the context of why that was done, and also the context of how women are centered as protagonists in the construction of socialism in Nicaragua. I mean, they have policies that force you to have 50% of people in office women, and so just the aid that they have for parenting is incredible. So it's a completely different context. And I wanted to add, someone, our comrade NC Kai, she brought up the Rockefellers and their support for Margaret Sanger. I've read a lot of Margaret Sanger's work. I had to read it. I had a seminar a couple years ago on the history of American radical thought. And I disagree heavily with Sanger's work, because the way she viewed the world was through a quite reformist lens. She saw that the working class was living in bad conditions, and she felt like, instead of looking at the existing order and the capitalist class as the root cause of this, she said that, hey, what we can do is just have workers stop making more workers, because since labor power is a commodity, the more of it there is, the less is paid for it, right? It's just basic economics. So if you have less workers, or if you have less kids, you have less workers, and less workers means that wages can stay up higher. So that was one of the economic arguments for that. And at some point, she has a really strong Malthusianist turn, and she writes articles criticizing Marx in a very just dumb way, where you can realize that she never really studied Marxism seriously. But either way, like, I think that the issue of abortion is should be somewhat separated from the flaws and Malthusianist influence of Margaret Sanger, because, I mean, like I mentioned, it's been an issue that socialists have been very clearly in favor of a woman's ability to have a safe abortion. Lenin has written on this, and we're talking, again, basically 100 years ago, right? Socialism was on the right side, and we have 2022 America stripping the rights of women. So,
Yeah, I agree. Thank you to the Day B for another super chat. I know you, this comrade sent a handful of super chats, so I really appreciate the support, the financial support for our project there. Says, you guys have been a big influence on my recent journey to learn about U.S. imperialism and communism. Thank you for all that you do. Also, nothing more American than being pro-life and pro-war. Yeah, that's another. I mean, there's so many hypocrisies. Like, I grew up not only did I grow up in a family who was Republican, but I grew up in a family who mostly claimed they were Republican. Like, I'm not even talking immediate family here, like a whole side of one of my families said they were Republican because of the pro life issue, that because so many babies are being killed, that we need to go vote for George Bush, and these Republicans. And then, as soon as I started getting into politics, I was like, what about all the war? like that's not pro life. And then I like pointed that out to my parents as they were leaving the Republican Party already, but they were like, yeah, this makes no sense. So, of course we could dismantle the quote unquote pro life position of like neocon Republicans too. They're not actually pro life. I want to ask too, this is just a good question that people have a lot, that I think I've answered a lot, but I'd like to hear your perspective, or we can have a conversation about it. But what do you think about the Nordic countries and their attempts to implement a more socialist state? So, we heard candidates like Bernie Sanders talking about how we need socialism like Switzerland and Sweden and Finland and Denmark, where they have universal health care, free college oftentimes, basically just a larger welfare state for their people. And some of them often have more unions or more organized workforce as well, which is part of how they've gotten to this situation. But I'll go ahead and let you give your perspective on that after I say thank you to Mr. Memes for the $20 super chat. Holy crap. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that support. Going to protest tomorrow. I'm planning to protest for about 8 hours. Thank you for educating the left. Well, thank you for your work. Super glad that people we're talking to, or people who feel like we're educating them, are going and organizing. Like, that makes me so happy I can't even put it into words. So solidarity, comrade. All right, Carlos. Nordic countries.
Um, there's two central things that I would like to say here. The first one is, of course, that the Nordic countries, I don't consider them socialist. They exist geopolitically in a location where they're benefactors of US, NATO, imperialism. The sort of allegory that I've used in the past to talk about the Nordic countries is that of a getaway driver, right? If the Okay, we got some music in the background. I don't know where does that come from.
Whoops.
The allegory I've used in the past is that of a getaway driver. The Nordic countries like the getaway driver, where the U.S. and NATO are the people that go into the bank and actually rob the bank, and the ones whose face you can see more clearly. You don't see the driver, but the driver still is a benefactor from the activity of robbing a bank, which is an unfortunate allegory to use because someone very dear to our tradition was a bank robber to fund the the socialist revolution. But anyways, we of course have to see them as benefactors of U.S. imperialism, and as part of the process which shares the loot of resources and super profits extracted from the East and the global South. The second thing that I'd like to say is that just in terms of how the question was posed, let me see if I find the question.
Sorry.
Do you find the question that?
Yeah, I can find it for you.
Okay, yeah. So it implies that it is the states that are implementing these policies, and that's never actually the case. When you see these strong welfare states in Europe, it's a result of class struggles. It is a result of workers unionizing and fighting for better living conditions, because the loot that is extracted from the global South via imperialism is not automatically distributed evenly to all of society. And we've seen this after 50 years of neoliberalism, where the US, even though it's the imperial hegemon, has half of its working class in a condition where they're one paycheck away from homelessness. So the conditions that exist that are more socialistic in these countries, they're a result of the battles of socialist and communist parties and of workers in general. If not that loot and that super profit that's extracted from the the global South wouldn't reflect itself in some of these programs, which, if you remove the aspect of capitalist imperialist exploitation, we would definitely be in favor of. So those are the two main things that I'd say. Like, the policies are a result of class struggle within those countries, um, which allows them to sort of share the part that they play in the extraction of imperialist super profits.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I mean, there's so many cases where you can point out where Denmark and Sweden and all these Nordic countries aid imperialism, and you've seen it with the conflict with Russia. You know, where sort of all the U.S.'s allies have lined up along imperialist lines. You've seen the Nordic countries have fallen in line and even said, you know, even though they've pretended to be non-interventionists for years now, they're like, yeah, we'll join NATO. You know, they're like floating the idea of just throwing that, you know, even the appearance of non-interventionism out the window when it comes time to support the U.S. or the imperialists in a sort of global conflict. And it's not that we don't support the welfare policies themselves, which you make a great point saying that those have been fought for by the workers. Because I see sometimes people saying like ultra left Maoists will call China social democratic, or they'll say, you know, Marxists who support China are sock dems because China's policies are somewhat social democratic. And it's like, you know, in a way, some of their policies are similar to social democratic policies. They create a safety net, a welfare net for their people. But they also have a dictatorship of the proletariat. You know, they have a communist party with 95 million members, cadres who belong to the Communist Party who are in charge of every geographical area or every town and city, communicating what the people need to the central party so that the production can be organized and economic plans can be created based around what the people need. Very different system already with what China's developed compared to the social democratic countries. But even if China was just implementing like various welfare policies, the fact that they have a dictatorship of the proletariat makes them different than these imperialist Nordic countries, which are still a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, just one in which the workers have fought for some minor benefits or gains.
Absolutely. And just to add a point that was well made in the chat, um, when there was the alternative, which I guess we have now with China, but during the first Cold War, when the alternative um, showed up at the global scale in the form of the Soviet Union and Eastern Socialism as an alternative to capitalism, providing good living standards to their people and more freedom, it is around the same time when a lot of these policies begin to emerge. Although in the Nordic countries, they had already existed before that, and but in Europe, in Western Europe, they definitely begin to emerge around this time, and in the U.S. as well. So that's always a factor. Like, one of the things that Marx holds in the towards the end of the first ever German preface to Capital, Volume One, is that if capitalists were smart, they would have like conditions like that. You know, like a strong welfare state that basically gave back some of the surplus extracted to the public so that it can, you know, not create the conditions where people are sort of forced to hit the streets. But we know that they're not smart, right? Like Engels shows us nicely in the end of his essay on the role that labor played in the transition from ape to man, which is one of the places to go for if you're looking at the views of Marx and Engels on ecology. There's a lot of other places to go as well, but he talks about how they're constantly forcing conditions where they're destroying the environment, but they're so short-sighted that they don't really care. And it's kind of the same thing with how capital treats labor, right? Or the embodiments of capital and the capitalists, how they treat labor. They're so concerned with the immediate realization of surplus value into profit that they fail to realize that to save American capitalism, like Bernie was the guy, you know, like
Right.
and in general, like these social democratic politics are the best friend of capitalists, but they're so dumb and short-sighted that they don't even recognize that, right?
That was what was blowing our minds. I mean, you had a better grasp on Marxism than me during the Bernie campaign, but we were both beginners compared to where we're at now, and I knew almost nothing. But it was just blowing my mind. I'm like, why are the capitalists so staunchly against Bernie and the corporations? I'm like, don't they want this guy to like save capitalism, give people health care? But you have the specific interests of the insurance industry, and healthcare conglomerates have become extremely powerful, especially in the political sphere. And then, like you said, they won't give an inch. They're too concerned with the realization of of surplus value in the here and now, or doing it as fast as they can. And uh, what was like, oh yeah, and we were thinking during the campaign, we're like, you have all these Bernie people on the left ready to blow up the political establishment, and then in 2016 you have Trump like blowing up the right, and then in 2020 you literally have like armed Trump supporters who are ready to take over the Capitol. Like, your country's completely unstable. It's in an absolute political crisis, and the capitalists or the ruling class are still just like, too bad. We're just gonna be more autocratic. We're gonna start censoring you. We're gonna take away your guns. It's uh, kind of crazy to watch. Marx was right. Thank you, David Burney, for the super chat. Appreciate your support as always.
Thank you, David. David's a comrade. He was our first ever Patreon, and we've had a lot of amazing conversations with him through our book club. He's a real comrade. Um, yeah, absolutely, man. It also speaks. I hate using this phrase. It speaks volumes, but it does speak volumes to the disconnection that the ruling classes have from the mass of people. Um, because if they were more aware of how everyday people lived, they themselves would realize that we kind of got to do something to prevent these people from just overthrowing the whole existing order. It reminds me of the meme of Hillary Clinton entering a regular person's house and she's just like, "What the fuck is this?" Um, but yeah, I mean, if you got to think about it, most of these people already come from bourgeois families. All the people they've interacted with in their little private schools are, rich people, and the pundits of the bourgeois class, and they've made their whole career in that class. So it gets to a point where you have to realize that there's an actual like material cultural disconnection that prevents them from even understanding how ridiculous they look when they speak.
Yeah, I've heard people say there's like no different culture among the working class versus the ruling class in the U.S. anymore. I'm like, what? And I mean, the U.S. We've talked about how there's different cultures based on the different geographical areas of the U.S., but working people everywhere have a different, standard of living, a different way of being. Um, Bourgeois, ruling class, rich people are so disconnected from the way the masses live, especially the political elites. I mean, I had a family member who grew up extremely poor. Even I was like lower middle class growing up. They would have been even much less than that, and then married a rich person, and it's like they've already, after like a few years, completely forgotten what it was like to be poor. And you hear them complaining about not having um a fourth car or whatever, not having the newest things, and it's crazy that lifestyle and being around people who are of wealth and privilege um, creates a sort of elitist culture. Actually, that's what Parenti was talking about today when he was criticized in the. I was reading the assassination of Julius Caesar, and he's criticizing academic historians. He's like, they all hang out in these elitist social circles where there's sort of a dogmatic adherence to certain historical myths that prop up the American empire, and you are who you surround yourself with, or you become your environment. And most historians are just elitists who are mouthpieces for the bourgeoisie. And I was gonna lead that into something. Sorry. Um, my mom gave me a book when she found out I was a communist, and it was about somebody who lived in Mao's China. And I was like, okay, like, yeah, definitely, I'll read it. I'm not, just dogmatically thinking all communists are good. And it was a lady who was like, my family had a beautiful mansion and we owned like acres and acres of oil fields in China, and had, our house towered over all the other houses. It was so great. And, the revolution took it away, and they repressed me so much. They put me in jail for like 5 years, but released me after 2 years. For like participating in the revolution and like killing revolutionaries. And then she's like, and then they let me leave. I'm like, oh, the horror of communism. But like, she didn't even realize that saying, I lived in a mansion and owned oil fields in China, that some people might be like, well, maybe you deserve to have some of your land redistributed.
Yeah, that's like the horrible dictator down in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who lets a literal funded opposition candidate just walk free, and who sends the police to protect him when the people are trying to throw chairs at his head. But it's the same. I mean, there's a good phrase that Pago Ignacio Taibo II, who's a fantastic Mexican historian, he did a series. He did a fat book, a fat biography on Che Guevara, and then he made it uh, into a telesaur series of like 18 episodes. And in one of the last episodes, when he's touching on the trials that take place after the revolution, these trials, the way that the Gusanos paint them, they don't even mention their trials. It's just like, oh, they just killed everyone. They killed X number of thousands of people. It was not democratic. It was just here, stand in the wall, and it was Che directly shooting them. And it couldn't be any farther from the truth. Like, there was committees where each trial, they took so much time because they wanted to make sure that the community that was affected by the actions of the specific individual was there, and it was a community that was deciding. And some of the times, Che even stopped some people from getting from getting killed, but it was democratically decided by the masses what is to be done with these people whose actions led to the killings of dozens and dozens of revolutionaries and the farmers that helped them. And so what Taibo says in the documentary is quite beautiful. He says, look, we can't ask reactionaries to stop being reactionaries, but we have to ask them to stop being fucking liars, right? And it's the same thing with China. It's the same thing with the defectors from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's the same thing with Cuba and Venezuela. Like, be a reactionary. Fuck you for being a reactionary, but be a reactionary. But stop fucking lying. Like, stop lying. At least stop lying, right?
They can't
Um,
help it.
they can't, right? Because their
You have
whole
to lie to justify the capitalism at this point, and the
yeah,
stage of capitalism we're in. And
absolutely.
go. Sorry, were you done?
No, I was just saying absolutely. I think I have a lag, so that might be.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah, and I've read Che's biography a year or two ago. John Lee Anderson is not a communist, but he did a really thorough biography of Che that he went to Cuba for. And the story he tells, or what he found to be the truth, was when they were fighting the revolution, like the first reactionary they had who had like killed I think it was somebody who betrayed them and gave away their position, and it allowed
mhm.
some of their friends to get killed. And the revolutionaries, the workers, the peasants voted, we are going to execute this person. But then it comes time to execute them, and they still didn't have many people with them at this point. Remember, it started out as 12 people after they got off the Granma and had a shootout. So they still didn't have many people at this point. Nobody wanted to carry out the execution. So Chase stepped up and carried out the execution, thinking, if I'm going to lead these people, or he said this, if I'm going to carry out this revolution with these people and expect them to shoot and kill for me, or shoot and kill for each other, then I have to be able to do it for them. So it is, dark, and it shows what revolution is. It's not a walk in the park, or it's not a picnic. But it's not, that Che was just this murderous war criminal. He struggled with having to do that, but it was ultimately in the spirit of democracy, really.
Yeah, and if you, well, I'd like to say thank you to David for the donation, and you're absolutely right. They do destroy themselves, but they have so much money that they could just go on and lie with a fancy haircut like the one my colleague has today, and a fancy suit, which neither of us have, and they just look believable, right? Just because of how much money's behind them. That's the PragerU phenomenon. But yeah, man, Che struggled to make those decisions, and some of the mistakes that they made while guerrilla warfare was still going on was trusting prisoners to like not do stuff if they released them. And a lot of the prisoners that were released did do things that were detrimental to the revolutionaries' movements. They gave away positions, and they gave away peasants and farmers who helped the revolutionaries, and a lot of people were massacred. And another part that's often not told, and I was told about this by my grandpa, who was a Catholic seminarian while the revolution was going on, and shortly after, when the revolution started sending uh, students to make schools and clinics in the farthest regions of Cuba, where in order to get to a hospital, you had to travel 2 days on foot. Michael Parenti has a video on this, but my grandpa was one of those people that would go out and open up little schools and teach and stuff. And there was a lot of people that were still there from the Batista time, a lot of Batista goons and U.S. agents that were still involved in attempting to bring forth a counter-revolution. And they would just get these squadrons of younger students, university students, people younger than you and me, who would go to just teach peasants and give them medical aid. And they would just massacre them. And these were the people that were then killed in the first few years of the revolution. And the people here in Miami have the audacity to talk about their uncles and grandparents who were repressed in Cuba, or who were this, or who were jailed. And what's never mentioned is what they did. What the crimes that they did. That's what's never mentioned.
Right, and there were horrific crimes committed. Similar with that book with Mao, that book I was talking about earlier about the lady whose family's oil company was taken under Mao. They were backing like counter-revolutionaries, literal fascists, and it's the liberals in the U.S. who are the first to call, communists or call actual left-wing people fascists, who are the first to side with the fascists when it's the U.S. empire. And when the empire is saying, oh, we need to support these fascists because it's better than supporting Russia or China or whoever else, which is an interesting phenomenon we've been pointing out, or we've pointed out a bunch. But speaking of Mao, I want to talk about that a little bit because, as I said at the beginning of the stream, I just finished Mao's quotes, and you've been reading some about China. Those are really interesting years. The Mao years of China, the first years of construction, as well as the pre-revolutionary period. So, what Mao's quotes does really well is it sort of breaks the revolution down into periods. So you have like in China it was the anti-colonial struggle at first against Japan, which at that point they were allying with the Kuomintang nationalists. They were allying with pretty much anyone who wanted to fight for China's independence. After that, they tried to make peace with the Kuomintang, but the Kuomintang sided with the imperialists, sided with the forces of reaction. The country broke into civil war. And China won, the communists won that, liberated their country, and then, began their process of socialist construction. So Mao breaks it down into the anti-colonial war, the civil war, and then socialist construction, which similar. Stalin breaks down the Russian Revolution similarly. I just read a bunch of Stalin too, but with Russia as an imperialist country, you have the pre-revolutionary period, which is peaceful in Russia, but they're still engaged in all these senseless wars for czarist expansion abroad or capitalist expansion. And then so you have pre-revolutionary, then you have a popular revolution, then you have the proletarian revolution. So different stages in China because they were subjected to colonialism rather than Russia, which was an imperialist country. So I thought that was an interesting distinction. But what do you think about Mao? What do you think we can learn from him? I guess one of the things I've heard about Mao is some people try and say he's he's not a sophisticated thinker. He was just like a war leader, or he didn't understand dialectics. the typical chauvinistic attitudes of Western academia. But yeah, what do you think about Mao as a philosophy professor?
I I think Mao is is in the top 5 minds of Marxism Leninism in the 20th century, right? If you try to just ignore everything he did practically, which is impossible, of course, because it informed his theory, but if you just look at his theory, um, there's so many contributions that are still shaping the socialist governance of China. And I have a whole chapter in the book that I'm working on where I try to analyze how dialectical materialism, or what at times, now that uh, China is going back to some of realizing that some of its traditional philosophy is also dialectical in nature, what they call contradiction analysis, how it influences socialist governance. And we see that in Mao Zedong's thought quite clearly. He introduces or he systematizes uh, a 3 sets of categories that I think are really, really important for dialectical materialism. The first one is principal versus secondary contradiction, and tied to that is the principal and secondary aspects of contradictions. And then you have antagonistic versus non-antagonistic contradiction. And socialist governance in China keeps these dialectical categories always at play in how they're analyzing their current situation. And so you have a context. Mao writes these texts. Just to put it into context, he writes on practice and on contradiction in 1937. Stalin writes what ends up being part 2 of chapter 4 of the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which we know now as dialectical and historical materialism, in 38. And then at the same time, you have J.D. Bernal and J.B.S. Haldane writing on the importance of dialectical materialism for the sciences. And these are two of the leading scientists in Britain. So it's like, holy shit, 1937, 38 was a great year to be a Marxist theoretician. But anyways, you see it in the period of New Democracy and how he's thinking about the class layout and who, to use an expression from Lenin, who the friends of the people are. And he says that the basis of the new democracy that's being created in China uh, is going to be a dictatorship of the revolutionary classes. And he includes within this, of course, the proletariat as the leadership in that dictatorship and in that coalition, but also the peasantry, the intellectuals, the petty bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie. So the actual bourgeoisie was considered a revolutionary class because the principal contradiction was imperialism and colonialism and the semi-feudal conditions in China. And so within the understanding of those of that principal contradiction, the bourgeoisie, if it doesn't ally with imperialism, with which some of it didn't, it finds itself in a revolutionary position. So that period of new democracy that lasts until like 53, 54, after the death of Stalin, when they switched towards the Great Leap Forward, which leads to mistakes. And then you have the Cultural Revolution, which also contains certain mistakes and lapses of dialectical thinking, in my view. But that period of new democracy, which you could really see it at play in the liberated areas even before the founding in 1949 of the People's Republic of China, it really created something like what we see in China today. There was a mixed economy where the sort of state enterprises were the ones that uh, was the largest sector and the sector in with the most control. Private capital was allowed to exist, but it was limited to a certain point, and that point was insofar as if it grows to a size where it can begin to influence uh, governance away from meeting people's needs towards expanding capital, then it has to be limited. And there was also cooperatives, a lot of cooperatives that were promoted. So it was a really interesting time in China that I think that what we have in this post Deng sort of Xi Jinping era where common prosperity is being re-emphasized again, is somewhat of a return to the principles of new democracy, which I think is showed the theoretical brilliance of Mao, not just in elaborating these dialectical categories, but in applying Marxism Leninism to a specific context and realizing that the conclusions that were brought about in the Soviet Union cannot be just copied and pasted into China, because China is a colonial country. And the main thing that they have to worry about first is sovereignty and development, and that they need that revolution that Russia was able to have in 1905, the bourgeois revolution. They need it, but because the Soviet revolution had already taken place, the Bolshevik revolution had already taken place, that bourgeois revolution in China is going to have a new character, and that's why it's called new democracy, because it's a bourgeois democratic revolution, but not led by a bourgeoisie. It doesn't create a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, but it's a dictatorship of the revolutionary classes led by the proletariat. So this is all novel analysis that is a result of a genuine, concrete understanding of the situation in China, an expansion of the categories of dialectical materialism and the application of those to the context in China, so that you can have the conclusions that they did early on in the revolution. And we've seen it throughout the history of China as well, which is overwhelmingly positive, and which led ultimately to the largest anti-colonial revolution in history. So whoever says that Mao is not a serious thinker is an idiot. In short, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Mao and Stalin often get linked together, which is probably fair, because they were both involved in revolutions and led the construction of two of the first socialist experiments. Um, but I think a lot of their importance comes from their practical thought, or what they wrote about their practical experience, which obviously the dialectical method is going from thought back to experience, back to thought again. But they had such a wealth of experience in, like I said, pre-revolutionary periods, revolutionary periods, and then the period of construction. And one of the things that stood out to me, I remember when I first started reading it, was how primary the contradiction of imperialism is for both Stalin and Mao, even more so than Lenin, because Lenin's writing the first, concrete analysis of it. But as both Stalin and Mao, as they begin actually trying to construct socialism, they're like, okay, imperialism is the primary contradiction in the world, because, obviously the Soviet Union's invaded by every Western country, then has to fight the Nazis, and China, as Carlos said, was a colonized country, so they had dealt with imperialism for years, and their first step in building socialism has been maintaining their sovereignty, and then to go off of something that you said, and relate it to them learning from their practical experience. Lenin had the theory of, or even Engels actually had written about the theory of proletariat allying with the peasants. So, the underclasses allying together and rallying around the proletariat. And then Lenin brought that out of Engels, and made it more concrete and said, this is what we need to do in semi-feudal countries with a large peasant population. And then Stalin is writing how, by our experience, the experience of the Bolshevik Revolution, it's been proven that this is possible, that you can have a revolution of the underclasses, and it can be like sort of a bourgeois revolution or popular revolution, but rallied around the proletariat. And then China goes on to do the same thing, but with different conditions in a country, as we were saying, which was not an imperialist country, but a largely feudal country who had been colonized for years. So their concrete experience that the results of the revolution are what confirm, various Marxist theories. And yeah, it's just really valuable to read, even though snooty bourgeois academics will tell you that Mao and Stalin aren't sophisticated or worth your time. They are.
Absolutely. And there's also, I forgot to mention, another distinction that is very valuable between economic and political capital. And the thinkers of the Chinese the Communist Party of China, recognize that you have to fully expropriate political capital and expropriate economic capital according to where you are in terms of the development of the means of production, which means that the switch is towards a political focus on control of the state apparatus and its institutions, and a little bit less on economics, right? Which changes sort of the framework of how Marx thought about the socialist revolution. And whereas bourgeois Marxism would say, "Oh, look, this is how they're not really Marxists. This is them distorting it." No, that's them realizing through concrete experiences what it's like and the necessity of developing the forces of production and realizing, as Marx and Engels had already done, that socialism is not poverty. Socialism is not a fetishization of asceticism where everyone's poor. Socialism is the development of the means of production to the point where people can be free enough to just work voluntarily because they feel like that is something that they want to do, and they feel that in doing so they can creatively express themselves and be fruitful and develop and flourish as human beings. So that distinction between how much you expropriate and that distinction between economic and political capital, I think, is very central to the thinking of socialism from the 20th century, the experience that we learned from the 20th century and that we carry on now in the 21st.
Agreed. I want to respond to this comment too. It says China is doing some of the things that they did right after 1949, but now they can do it with wealth, which is true. I mean, if you read Xi Jinping, it does seem almost like a return to Mao in some ways, or he's, bringing socialism back a little bit. But also, I want to be careful with like completely divorcing Deng Xiaoping from Mao or modern China from Mao's China, because oftentimes, there's an idea that Mao's China was just this, perfect left or communist utopia, and then they had the market reforms, and now it's a completely different thing. But the market reforms were being debated in the party during the time of Mao, and they were built on top of the economic foundation and the economic base that Mao built. The market reforms and opening up would have been totally impossible without that sort of foundation and the industrialization stuff that happened under Mao. And what I noticed too when I was reading Mao's quotes is most of the ultras who call themselves Maoists or Maoist third worldists, who are like, Mao would have just hated modern China and thought it was garbage. It's like, no, Mao would have hated you. Mao would have hated these dogmatic ultra left pseudo Marxists, and he would support modern China even if he had disagreements with it, which I'm sure he would. And understand that modern China would be absolutely impossible without Mao. They built it, off of him, and Deng Xiaoping was involved in the party debates under Mao as well, and he was still a member of the party then.
Yeah, I was the target of one of those rants from a Maoist. I have published an article on why Western Marxism misunderstands China's usage of markets, which we published, and it was republished by the Friends of Socialist China. And a week after, I see a response from a Maoist, and the whole response was like, "He didn't quote Mao, man." Ridiculous, but yeah, what Deng does is apply dialectical materialism to the existing situation in China to see what the primary contradiction was, and he realized that the primary contradiction was a not very developed forces of production in China and the unequal, the inequalities that existed between China and the developed world, and even just the non-developed world. I read a quote from John Bellamy Foster's introduction to Sheng and Fu's book that I just bought. I started reading it right here, actually. So far from what I've read, I would recommend it. It's called China's Economic Dialectic. It's from international publishers. But anyways, one of the things that John Bellamy Foster mentions at the beginning of the book in the introduction, let me see if I can pull up the quote real quick. Is that the per capita income in China was only 1/3 of that of sub-Saharan Africa. So, I mean, just put it in the context of today, China is the second richest country in the world. And in before the reform and opening up period, it was one third. Their per capita was one third of sub-Saharan Africa, which was poor, right? So Deng realized that the people that were calling themselves Maoists during the time of the Cultural Revolution, they weren't Maoists. They were doing precisely what Mao urged against, which was book worshipping. They were worshiping the conclusions without understanding the context and forgetting about the method, which is really the essence of the matter. So Deng applied the method and realized that what we need is to develop the forces of production and break the inequality that exists between China and the rest of the world. They achieved that in 1999. They kept that up, but with a focus on the rural regions, and then in 2017, and in general with the leadership of Xi Jinping since 2012, I believe, the focus has been to address common prosperity and development within China, reducing the inequality that exists within China, and creating an ecological society. So, in throughout the whole process and the different periods of China, what you see is dialectics playing a central role in how the world is analyzed, and then subsequently how governance takes shape. And always the focus is lifting the living standards of the mass of people. And they've broken every single goal that they've had. They wanted to abolish poverty by 2021, and they were able to do that months ahead of schedule. So I have great faith in China.
Yeah, I think China. I mean, it's hard because the USSR combated imperialism really well under Stalin, but eventually the USSR, as well as Yugoslavia, um, did fall to imperialism. And one of the theories I have about that, I mean, the USSR's dissolution was complicated, and there were internal and external contradictions that led to it. But one thing that I guess I think has allowed China to be successful into the 21st century, unlike a lot of other socialist experiments who had a lot of success, is they're the one country who understands finance capital post World War II, or applies dialectics to the system of geopolitics and imperialism and finance capital, because we know imperialism prevents countries from developing their productive forces. We know imperialism holds countries in poverty, which Deng analyzes and says this is the main contradiction for China. But these imperialist institutions that we're used to today, that we recognize today, were just coming about at the end of World War II. That includes the IMF and the World Bank and the UN and NATO as well, I believe, or maybe NATO existed before that. But either way, post World War II, you have the construction of this international, global, Western, imperialist-dominated financial system, which Vijay Prashad lays out very, very well in Washington Bullets. And there's also these U.S.-backed or involved military alliances all over the world, which work together in enforcing these or the global financial system. And what China's done with their Belt and Road, and then with the market reforms and opening up, and allowing some of this private capital in, has been the most genius move in combating imperialism that we've seen any socialist country do. And then other countries like Cuba and Vietnam, I believe, has based part of their policy off China, but they fought. Vietnam's got better relations with the U.S. than China. It's a different situation, but um, every socialist country has followed suit. They're not the academics in these countries, or even the working classes in these countries, or Communist Party members, aren't pointing and saying, you're not real socialism anymore. You opened up to some private capital, or saying, no, this has allowed us to build an anti-imperialist alliance. Let's keep going, keep offering countries developmental loans, get them away from the IMF and World Bank, get them away from these structural adjustment loans and this bullshit that's prevented the productive forces from developing in Africa and Latin America and Southern Asia and other places as well for years.
Yeah, and you also have to look at the character of their opening up. What do they get from the opening up? It's not just obviously an increase in wealth that is redistributed amongst the population and that raises the living standards, but they also obtain in that opening up process the condition to create the apparatuses that they have now in order to oppose imperialism. So if you look at the contracts that they do with the major capitalist firms, part of the process of opening up contained the ability to get sciences and technologies so that whatever was the highest technological development going on in the capitalist imperialist Western world, China was also able to obtain. And so we find today China is even more technologically developed than the West. And that's one of the benefits of the opening up, reform and opening up period that's often never talked about, which is the importance that it played in order to achieve, what Zhao and Lai had first labeled as the four modernizations, the things that are necessary in order to have a healthy, developed Chinese state, a healthy and developed area of sciences and technology and defense and security. So these were focuses that towards the end of Lenin's life, he turns his attention to. If we read the last thing he ever writes, which is Better Few But Better, and some of the other texts that he engages, that he writes before in the 1922, 1923, right before Better Few But Better, the focus is turned towards how do we make a more efficient state? How do we make a more efficient state? How do we develop our technologies and our scientific capacities? They even looked at Taylorism, a phenomena which in the US was used to suck out the juice of workers more and extract more surplus, but they looked at it as a way to make economic production more efficient. And so one of the things that I think that reform and opening up has allowed China to achieve is that wealth of knowledge that is brought about by specialist and technological developments in the West that Lenin emphasized so much towards the end of his life and in his latest writings.
Yeah, I don't know if I had to run for refill my water there, so I missed part of what you said there. But one of the strategies of the empire in Venezuela has been luring their technical workers and their skilled workers and engineers out of the country, to try and just dismantle their economy in any way. And same with North Korea and trying to get people to defect. So yeah, China also combated that, and that's kind of what I mean when I talk about Mao and Stalin. Their practical experience in actually building socialism, like, really showed them what imperialism was all about, and showed them how to combat imperialism, and gave them the experience and the wealth of knowledge about imperialism in order to be able to do something like what China's done, and build socialism despite it. Because the US will do stuff like offer contracts or bribes to your skilled workers, or in Korea, in the South, they would offer people like $1 million if you would run into the North and cut off a cow's tail and run back with it, because you were killing the livestock, making it easier to starve people. So they got a firsthand experience of how, like, ruthless this shit is, and the lengths that capitalists are willing to go to hang on to their system. So why doesn't the DPRK open up like China? It's a great question. The DPRK has tried to join the World Bank and the IMF for years. They're excluded from that global financial system, which kind of shows you how crazy, not how crazy, how strong uh, the Workers' Party and the workers' movement is in the DPRK, and how dedicated they are to hanging on to their sovereignty and their self-determination, because they are not allowed to join the IMF and the World Bank and do something similar to China. Yet they're still socialist and they're still doing construction.
Do you know what's interesting? I didn't click on it to watch it, but I saw that quick ad preview that Netflix does when you hover over something, and they did a Korean version of Casa de Papel, which I'm blanking on the English name now. It's not House of Cards. It's the one where they rob the bank. You know which one I'm talking about? Where they put the masks on
I
of
don't know.
of Dali. Can someone in the comments help me? Casa de Papel in English. What's the name of the show?
House
Casa
of Cards.
Money Heist. There you go, Money Heist. They did a Korean version of Money Heist, and the sort of preview that they gave, it started with the lines of, so when the North finally decided to open up, inequality started rising. It was something like that, right? And I turned to my wife and I was like, you see, that's propaganda, because the North has been trying to open up and be included within the global community so that it can develop. It is the imperialist powers which have been preventing it consistently from doing so. And at the same time as they prevent them from being included into the international community in order to develop, they point at them and they spew the propaganda that look how isolated they are. They're isolated because we have fucking isolated them, right? They're not isolated from China and Russia and Cuba, who they've continued to trade with, not just for ideological similarities, because these are the countries that are willing to undergo the effects of the blockade that the U.S. has on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right? And I don't want to insinuate that the question from Eli was like in a negative connotation. I'm just saying that it reminded me of the preview from the show.
Oh, for sure. And the DPRK has cell phones now. They've opened up some. They've been able to form some trade lines, and they get cell phones from Egypt. So yeah, they don't want to be isolated. It's not a place where the government, is trying to hold people in poverty on purpose. It's a place where they're trying to pursue construction for their people, but they can't get developmental loans from the IMF or World Bank unless they privatize a bunch of their economy and eliminate labor regulations and whatever else, which they're not going to do because they're a socialist country. Carlos, unless you had anything else you want to talk about, just off the top of the dome, I have a couple of videos pulled up that we could react to if you're down for that. Unless you had another topic you wanted to hit.
No, I'm fine to react.
Sweet. So we got one about Biden's polling numbers tanking and the media ignoring it. There's one of Kyle Kulinski responding to Mehdi Hassan about healthcare. So basically, two social democrats talking about healthcare. We have a guy from the DDR, East Germany, talking about his life there. It's a long video, but I was told to watch just like the first 5 minutes. We have PragerU, is communism moral?
Is it Victor Grossman, the DDR
Yeah.
one? Okay, I've been trying. We've published him before in Midwestern Marx, and I'm trying to schedule some form of interview with him. So, fingers crossed. But his life is insane. I've seen a few of those videos about his life. It's just incredible.
Yeah. So do you want to watch his video, or do you want to watch something else? It's because we're gonna have him on.
Whatever you want to watch, I'm fine with. I'm fine with all of those options.
All right. Let's watch a boring political one first, because actually this one was. We've been talking about philosophy.
I've seen enough.
But this video I found really interesting today when I was kind of catching up on the news. It's about Biden's polling numbers, because I assumed that they were doing. I had heard they were bad. But a lot of people in the Midwest are just like, oh, screw Biden, he's the worst, he's gonna get killed. But I've been hearing that his polling numbers were bad, and obviously the economy is pretty bad. Biden hasn't followed through a lot of his promises, but like his numbers are worse than I thought. It's looking pretty bad for the Democrats, which means I'm sure they're banking on some kind of miracle here, or mobilizing their voters around the Roe v. Wade repeal. But let's watch a bit of this video here. This is Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk talking about Biden's polling.
To conclude that I think Biden's political Armageddon is upon us. I think he's done. So look at these new numbers. I'm gonna walk you through all this here. Biden's approval among the youngest voters is 25% in latest Quinnipiac poll, the lowest of any group but Republicans, and 30 points underwater. Somehow, his obliteration among this huge progressive group has merited scarcely a word of press coverage. So this is an important point. The media oftentimes shapes the agenda. And of course, the argument that you hear from the media time and time again in reference to Biden and Democrats in general is that, oh my God, they've gone too far left. They're too radical. They're catering to Bernie Sanders and AOC. Now, substantively, this criticism is absurd because Biden is doing anything but that. But here's a real story that they could write up if they cared about honesty. And the story is a key voting demographic group for Democrats that Democrats need in order to win. It has completely and utterly abandoned them. So again, 25% for the youngest voting demographic. And then here, let me show you.
So young people are fed up. I watched a lot of young people, a lot of Bernie campaign people last year get shamed by older people into voting for Biden. I do not think that's going to happen again this year because Biden, he promised young people a lot and he didn't follow through on anything. And he continues to ship more and more weapons and money to Ukraine as economic crises hurt people at home, legitimate economic crises, things like, high gas prices, which everybody in the country feels and makes everybody in the country angry, and look to the political administration, except for maybe liberal Democrats. They'll get mad at you if you try and criticize Biden for that. But yeah, and it's so fascinating that the media is not talking about this. It's like they're either CNN and MSNBC are trying to downplay the political crisis and make it seem like it's not as bad as it is. But I mean, 25% for a liberal candidate who, like Kalinsky said, is often getting criticized by CNN for being too left. He's got 25% of support against young voters who are, overwhelmingly left wing or progressive. So yeah, what do you think about that? What do you think about the media's silence on it? Your mic's off there.
I was saying that I agree with the comments that 25 is too high. Like what's that 25? I think those are the ones, like a certain progressive American, which you have reacted to in the past. I think that might be of those 25. But you did a video after I think the first 100 days of Biden in office that was titled something along the lines of a Marxist analysis of Biden's governance so far, or something like that. And one of the things you pointed at is that there was a little bit of hope with like the at least semblance of a friendly to labor discourse, and programs like the Build Back Better. And what we have found is that the discourse that he has sustained has been merely in form. It's been merely symbolic. He hasn't done anything. So there's really nothing that any progressives, even small p progressives within the Democratic Party, can point at and be like, "Oh, that's good." There's nothing, right? The only thing they can point at is words that he has said that have not been followed through action at a time when the Democrats control everything politically. So to think that the solution or even the band-aid for any of the problems that we have now is voting for Democrats, it takes a lot of mental gymnastics for you to get to that conclusion. I don't even think that there's a lot of people that especially are communists or socialists, and they know that the Democrats are not the response to the current crisis. But then they'll say something along the lines of they're a little better, and by being a little better, they're like a band-aid on the existing order. That's just, you can't even argue for that anymore. It's just absurd. Maybe at some local level or at a state level, we were talking the other day, how depending on whether it's Democrats or Republicans holding office in a specific state, like food benefits change, right? And what you can buy, like what I can buy with food stamps here in Florida is different from what I can buy in Illinois. But like, there is no substantive difference between the Democrats and the Republican, besides one that's a discourse. And I think that ultimately, because of how insidious being only better in discourse is, we should, as socialists, just decide to not vote for Democrats at all. I didn't. I've never had in my life, with the exception of Bernie in the primaries. But I know there was a certain vote against fascism movement last election that I don't think that is going to be passing this time around, because we realize that the Democrats are voting are voting in favor of war credits to fascists and are promoting fascism, and not just fascism, Naziist fascism, which is a whole lot fucking scarier.
And Democratic media apparatuses are having weapons contractors come on to sell this war. You know, those are the propagandists. Those are the people they're bringing on as experts. We played a video the other day that was a compilation of all the literal people, you know, literal weapons contractors, people who work for Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, going on CNN and talking about Ukraine. And you said that the Democrats are better in rhetoric. I mean, that basically just means that they're better at lying, you know, or that they're liars. If you're doing the same thing, but your rhetoric is better, that just means that you're doing more lying, you know, whereas the neocons are just honest about what they do. And I know that I agree that we should boycott the Democratic Party. Don't vote for Democrats. I've been thinking that we should call for that as the election draws closer, kind of take that line. But I know that the argument's going to be used, you know, we need to do this to fight fascism, which, one, that was not a new argument for liberal Democrats under Trump. They've been saying that since Nixon. But also opinions like this that Natalie Wynn ContraPoints put out are not something I agree with. So let me know. You can let me know what you think of this. I don't know if you saw it, but it says, I can't even enjoy the anti-corporate pride jokes because to me, gay cornflakes or whatever feels like one of the few remaining signs that, or gay cornflakes or whatever, feels like one of the few remaining signs that fascism isn't winning. And it's like, this just shows that among these like synthetic leftists, there's just no understanding, or they won't even entertain the idea that the liberal Democratic Party, the current leader of the empire, could be the fascistic party, and that them, you know, co-opting these left-wing social movements and using them for murderous exploitation and imperialism is not actually fighting fascism. You know, it resembles fascism more than a lot of things, or a lot of groups in this country. So, yeah, I don't know if you agree with that analysis or what.
Well, that's just woke imperialism. That's rainbow washing the most murderous apparatuses that humanity has ever known. And that's horrific, right? And we can't be fooled. This is why it's important to understand dialectics. Noah, he's doing this series called 1 Minute Marx, where he gets the basics and he explains it. He did one, I think it was the second one. It was on the dialectic of form and content. You have to realize what is liberatory just in form and what is actually liberatory in content, right? And putting on the CIA a rainbow flag, or on the FBI just raised the fucking rainbow flag, an LGBTQ flag today in their headquarters. It's like, you know, so especially when we look at the discourse that imperialism, especially its left wing, has used against anti-imperialist and socialist projects, it's all been surrounded around wokeism, and wokeism is used today as one of the key ideological legitimations for empire. I'm sorry, maybe there's a better word for it. I know that the right uses it. I don't like it because the right uses it, but I think it's the right word to describe the phenomenon. Maduro has to be overthrown because he's a dictator who oppresses LGBTQ people. It doesn't matter that that's bullshit. It's about the narrative. Cuba has to be overthrown because they repress black and people of color artists. It doesn't matter that the artists were funded by the NED. That doesn't matter. China oppresses Uyghur minorities. It doesn't matter that that's bullshit and it's been confirmed as bullshit. None of that matters. It's just used in the discourse, and it has a systematic character at this point, and we have to call it out, right? And we have to be able to distinguish what are the groups that, in attacking wokeism, they fall into bigotry and that we should, fight against, and what are the groups that are actually trying to analyze the existing condition concretely and see how it is that wokeism is being used to legitimize empire. And we can't see that better than when the FBI, like they did today, they raised the LGBTQ flag, or when the CIA in the recent ad, they really emphasized the diverse environment that they create in the CIA by having a Latina, lesbian, women of color, and you just keep adding these determinations and talking about how at home she feels at the agency. The fuck is that? This is the agency that has been the most antagonistic to oppressed and working people around the world, and now you want to rainbow wash it. Like, get the fuck out of here. And we got to stop as communists equating every critique of this to what the right does. It's not. It's a real phenomenon, and we have to analyze it concretely and see how it's used to legitimize imperialist attacks. We can't just stick our head in the sand and say it doesn't exist.
Yeah, they're literally telling you to support Biden to fight fascism as he's sending arms and weapons to fascists, open, self-avowed fascists. Literally, like, I will not be treated like a fool or duped again. When people tell me I need to vote Biden to fight fascism in 2024, I'm going to be like, tell me who the Azov battalion is. You know, if I vote Biden, my tax dollars are going to be used to pay for weapons that literally go to fascists. How the hell how can you say to me that that is in any way fighting fascism, or that by Biden doing that, and then allowing gay cornflakes, allowing cornflakes, which is probably a company attached to the military industrial complex. They probably give the soldiers cornflakes as an option for breakfast cereal in the morning. So cornflakes is probably lobbying for war. But you're telling me that Biden is arming fascists, but when cornflakes puts a rainbow on the breakfast cereal, that's bringing an end to fascism? Like, this is absurd, and this is idealism. Also, and yeah, I don't know. People have in the chat. I know people are fans of some of these breadtube figures like Natalie Wynn, who made that tweet, and everybody makes mistakes, but like, just be skeptical. She was found to be attached to Valent Projects, which is connected to the British State Department. So, you never know. You got to be skeptical, and we got to learn to apply dialectics, like Carla said. You can't just, you know, internalize and accept and support anything that sounds left wing. Because you're not, when you say gay cornflakes are fighting fascism or whatever, you're not supporting the LGBTQ community. You're supporting imperialism co-opting the LGBTQ struggle and using it to kill people and support fascists who are not a big fan of the LGBTQ community.
Absolutely. All of the struggles of the oppressed and marginalized communities are aligned with the struggle of the working class against capitalism, because it is the state and the apparatuses of capitalism which oppress these communities. And so whenever you see that discourse co-opted, as some people in the chat have described it, you have to be worried about whether it's actually something liberatory that actually wants to represent people in the marginalized communities, that is informed representing. And I mean, during the Black Lives Matter summer protests in 2020, the same companies that were donating hundreds of millions to their local police departments were hashtagging BLM on their social media. Like, it's absurd, and you have to fight against it, because not only does it damage the struggle for socialism, but because the struggle for the liberation of these oppressed and marginalized communities is tied to the working class's struggle for socialism, it also tarnishes the actual potential for liberation for these communities. And it sees liberation merely as the ability to diversify who it is that's going to oppress and exploit the mass of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's freedom of exploitation, I guess. Everybody has the freedom to be the exploiter now. I got one more video I'm down to watch, but do you want to go PragerU, is communism moral, or do you want to talk about the Disinformation Governance Board and Nina Jankowicz? So, kind of funny political news story, or do you want to talk about communism and use theory to laugh at PragerU?
I love shitting on PragerU, especially because people love to talk about how we pay more attention to like the fake leftists and pseudo Marxists than the right. So I think every chance we have to shit on the biggest funded right wing think tank is a positive.
Agreed. All right. That's also not. I mean, I'm all about self-criticism and responding to criticism, but that is not a true criticism. Prager, you and me and their commentators have gone back and forth before. They've targeted us because we called them out so many times. Like our biggest videos are calling out Jordan Belfort and people who are anti-Venezuela. But regardless, I agree. Let's debunk the goofiest, most well-funded propagandists maybe of all time. PragerU.
Motives are much less important than behavior. We all know this. If someone has good intentions but treats people badly, those good intentions mean nothing. As it is with individuals, so it is with governments. Capitalism might sound less noble than communism. The individual pursues success to the best of his abilities. That's capitalism. Versus everyone shares everything equally. That's communism.
Did we already watch this one or not?
No, but it's the same stupid arguments all the time.
I know they
Literally
repeat the
the
same thing.
It's the same argument from the guy that had the Justin Bieber haircut.
Oh, they're just reusing the same graphic, aren't they?
Yeah, same argument, same script, same graphics, just a different guy. Now they got Dennis Prager on there.
Wow. Well, either way, me and Carlos are both ultra leftists, Maoist third worldists now, and we're actually Pol Potists, and we believe that communism is actually when everyone's equally poor. So everyone embrace Pol Pot thought.
Eddie and I only brush our teeth twice a month because we have to shoot it to each other in order to do it because we share the toothbrush as well.
Yeah, that's true. I just got Carlos shipped me a bunch of loose leaf papers in the mail. He copied down all 3 volumes of Capital, so I don't actually have to buy the book and support capitalist exploitation. So we're being good ultras.
I think that one of the things that's always important to restate is that capitalism and the culture that emerges with it creates these artificial dichotomies between the individual and the community in order to perpetuate its ideology. And what communism or Marxism seeks to do is to show how the interest of the individual is bound with the interest of the community. So we don't destroy the individual, but we want to seek conditions so that the individual can flourish as best as possible in a way that is not in contradiction to the community, which is something pretty commonsensical that the existing order that we're in, most individuals aren't free. So if you were really an egoist that was concerned with self-interest and creating conditions for individual freedom, you'd realize that maybe I'm ignorant about communism, but this is definitely not it. So when we hear the words freedom, when we hear the words liberty, when we hear the word success, we have to think about another entity because it's not humans that they're talking about. They're talking about the freedom, the success, and the liberty of capital, not human beings, of capital, right? So, I mean, that's it.
Yeah, it's freedom of markets and market exploitation. You know, when countries, what really prompts the U.S. or the U.S. media to call a country authoritarian is when they infringe on market freedoms. You know, when they infringe on the freedom of transnationals to exploit. You know, they'll implement some labor regulations, and the U.S. starts saying this is an authoritarian top-down economy. You know, they don't care about freedom of people or even individuals. It's freedom of capital. And I guess, yeah, just one more point is we've talked about economic construction a lot on the podcast. We talk about how increasing the productive forces is always a thing in socialism, and sometimes that's confusing for some people. One, because you have this, this lie, this imperialist lie about socialism, that it's just making everybody equally poor, when in fact that's not what it is. But as Carlos said, socialism seeks to tie the interest of the individual to the community. So it's increasing the productive forces for the good of the community, for the good of the whole society. It's not increasing the productive forces via exploitation and allowing, capital to accumulate at the top. It's increasing the productive forces. So like in China, they could raise everybody out of poverty. And, there have been, like, the reason I was making the joke about Pol Pot, for those who don't know, he kind of tried to carry out this idea of let's do socialism but make everybody equally poor, and he was backed by the CIA too. But one of the first things they did was blew up the central bank, whereas Marxist socialist experiments, and Pol Pot and his higher ups admitted they never read Marx, they've actually taken state control of the bank or built banks so that they can finance developmental loans and bring about, as we said, economic construction for everybody. So yeah, this idea that communism makes everyone equally poor, not true.
Yeah, and a good counterbalance to show just the ultra character of Pol Pot, or I don't even think ultra is the right word. There's got to be a new term made up. If only we had Lenin to just come in and drop some terms. But the CIA socialism of Pol Pot, a good counterbalance to what he did in blowing up the banks is what an actual Marxist-Leninist would do, which is, before nationalizing it, before you have power, rob it and use the funds to fund the revolution. So you have Stalin and Pol Pot, and that's it. That's the midpoint. Somewhere there is truth. I'm just joking. But,
You have two paths.
Stalin or Pol Pot
path or the Pol Pot path.
Pick.
Midwestern Marx does not condone bank robbing. This is all hypothetical in a video game.
Be good to get pamphlets with Pol Pot and Stalin, and like kind of the religious pamphlets, and be like, you have two options. Pick.
It's like you and me floating in the air with like outstretched hands, like, come to Stalin.
Like the Matrix. What pill do you want? Pol Pot or Stalin?
Take the Stalin pill.
Always take them both. That's always the right answer. Always take both pills. But this is a very serious segment.
Yes, very serious Pol Pot Stalin segment.
But it is capitalism that has produced freedom, and it alone has lifted millions from poverty, while communism has kept millions impoverished and, without exception, crushed freedom. Capitalism, for all its imperfections.
I mean, it's hard because they don't source anything. They just say stuff, so it's like, where are you getting this communism kept people in poverty? What about China's poverty alleviation programs? What about the poverty in the U.S. and every capitalist country now? But then just the abstract idea of crushing freedom. And like you said, that just means freedom for capital, and they talk about freedom in the abstract as this abstract concept, but the materialist understands that there is no abstract, societal freedom necessarily. And therefore, there's no way to just crush freedom, even if that was the goal of communism.
Absolutely. And yeah, China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Capitalism has had 500 years to abolish poverty. It has created more than enough wealth in order to do that. But yet, 5 people in the US at least own more wealth than the bottom half. The massive people are living in conditions of poverty or very near the poverty line. Half of the world is basically in poverty. How the fuck do you have the audacity to say that capitalism brings people out of poverty? That's not even true about the people within the imperial hegemon, where the super profits go. Like, what world are you living in? And that's what I'm saying. Like, you put a good graphic designer, one of these old white guys with a clean haircut and a nice suit, and you can say whatever the fuck you want. And millions of people are going to watch it. Look how many people have seen it. Almost 2 million people, right? And meanwhile, we bust our ass studying, looking up facts, and actually reading history books. And the algorithm says, fuck you.
We should have just been studying graphic designing and,
Yes.
and capitalist propaganda. I think I mean, for them to even say that, like you said, you have to live in a fantasy world, but it goes back to what Marx said with the ruling class of any society identifying the interests of the whole of society with their own interests. Who is capitalism raised out of poverty? Oh, only assholes like Dennis Prager. And that's why they keep telling us why it's the best system ever. Because it raised them out of poverty. So they're like, it's good for everyone, don't you see? Like, no, it's not good for the people working and dying in your factories, you lard.
And they were never in poverty. That's part of the myth of primitive accumulation, right? It's a concept we still use, and I'm okay with using it. But it's called the myth of the so-called secret of primitive accumulation. That's what the title and capital is, right? Because it's a myth that there was nothing and then something was created, right? Now today we think of the term primitive accumulation as accumulation by dispossession and the whole process of enclosing the commons and opening up the markets through the genocide in the Americas. And we use that term to describe that. But primitive accumulation was the way that they thought of this myth that first the really industrious worked, the others didn't work, and now we have rich people and poor people, and that's it, right? That's the myth.
Huh. That's I didn't even think to bring up the myth of primitive accumulation there. That's why you bring a philosophy professor to run your website, folks. All right. Let's jump back into this. I'll try and let it play a little bit longer this time.
Enables a decent society. Communism, whatever its stated intentions, leads to evil. Yet increasingly, people either ignore or deny the evil of this ideology, which within a period of only 60 years created modern totalitarianism and deprived more people of human rights and tortured and killed more people than any ideology in history.
Carlos, you're a smart guy. Why do you defend communism and deny that it always leads to evil, when in fact communism created modern totalitarianism?
I'm a totalitarian. That's it. No, but I think an important point to make, because it's difficult to watch this and not just say, look, you inverse the words capitalism and communism, and what they say is true. An important point to make is
all
that
projection. It's literally all projection. That's all their propaganda is.
Absolutely. But an important point to make is that a lot of the bullshit these people say is accepted and promoted and stems from so-called Marxist academics in the West, right? The studies on totalitarianism, those stem from the Frankfurt School, which was the first, I think even before the Ukrainian fascists, to equivocate Nazism and fascism with communism via the middleman of totalitarianism, because they were literally funded by the capitalist imperialists and by the CIA and by the intelligence agencies in Britain, and people like Hannah Arendt, the same thing, her text on totalitarianism. And it's that myth is accepted by a big portion of the left. And if you go into academia and you ask any professor, where can I study Marxism? Who can I study it with? They're going to point you to someone who specializes in critical theory in the Frankfurt School, or that specializes in the French. And so I think that the sort of real task ahead of us, I mentioned earlier that the people which are, I've engaged with a couple of them, but who criticizes for only focusing on the errors of the left. It's like, yeah, because you guys should fucking know better. Because you guys should know better. These people in the Frankfurt School, they should know better, but they don't, because it's against their material interest to know better. They're being funded by the capitalist state. And this is what's in academia. And these ideas, crazy though they might seem to us, they're accepted by most people within academia who consider themselves Marxist.
And Lenin and Marx criticize the right for sure, and you know, bourgeois economists and propagandists, but they criticize the left. They spend so much time criticizing opportunism on the left because, you know, we're trying to make the left or the workers movement into something that can take power. So you need to, you know, analyze your shortcomings and you know, try to get better. But yeah, with I went on a rant about this the other day on one of the streams. I'm sure some of the people in the chat saw it, but just the concept of totalitarianism itself was created, you know, to conflate communism with fascism, right? That's why you need another term for just, you know, an authoritarian government, as if the bourgeois democracy in the oligarchic imperial countries aren't authoritarian. They created this word to conflate communism, the people who were fighting fascism, with fascism, the people who were fighting the communists, because the liberal Democrats wanted to separate themselves from fascism when they were the actual fascist collaborators. So you have the CIA publishing all these books and you know, backing these controlled opposition figures like Hannah Arendt, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism. So the beginnings of totalitarianism. This is what totalitarianism is. It's Stalin and Hitler, and they're both equally bad. Worship bourgeois democracy. We're at the end of history. And it reminds me of something when I was first, not when I was first learning about Marx, but I was probably less than a year in. And I saw a video from Caleb Maupin, who obviously very controversial figure. You bring up Caleb in any left-wing circle, and you're going to have disagreements, but we agree with a lot of his thought. And he said, you know, basically what you said, if you go into a university somewhere and ask them who should I read to learn about Marx, they're going to give you someone like Hannah Arendt or some kind of French postmodernist. But what Caleb said is you need to read Xi Jinping. You know, you need to read the leader of China, who's applying Marxism in real life, and has to deal with real economic problems, the problems of today, to see where Marxism is in the 21st century. And I agree with that 100%. I've read Xi's book now. It's better than any of the crap that you'll read in some Congress for Cultural Freedom thinker. Not that you can't engage with those or find good stuff in them. But yeah, it goes back to what we were saying about Stalin and Mao, with the practical experience being good. I think we've probably gone a little bit off track here from a PragerU video, but
I just want to tie it back by saying that that equivocation of communism and fascism also allows you to ignore where fascism and Nazism really stem from, which if you look at the documents from the leading theorists, they're all inspired by the liberal project and by liberalism, the traditions of liberalism. So the inheritor of the tradition of liberalism is fascism. Fascism stems from capitalism and its decaying ideology. It has no connection whatsoever to communism. And the people that are like Hannah Arendt, right? She draws this connection by creating this mediational term, totalitarianism, in order to tie these two things that are antagonistic the one to the other. And at the same time, she's looking back at the racism and the genocidal attitudes of the early liberal theorists, and she's trying to normalize it by saying, oh, everyone thought like that. No, they fucking didn't. They didn't. That's bullshit. They didn't. They knew it was wrong, and that's why they would, specifically in the U.S., this back and forths that you would see from the loyalists and the rebels, right, from the folks that were waging the revolution against Britain and the people who wanted to be loyal. The arguments back and forth all centered really around the question of slavery. How can you talk against our absolutism when you hold these people enslaved, and then they're like, well, who brought them here? Who's perpetuating the slave trade? You guys are. They all knew it was fucked up. They all knew that the attitudes that they held towards the people in the Americas and towards the people outside of Europe in general were genocidal, and that they dehumanized them. They all knew that. So it's, in order to have that comparison, you have to forget the central role that the liberal tradition plays in its unfolding into fascism and its ugliest form in Nazism when capitalism hits, when the shit that capitalism produces hits the fan.
excellent point and analysis.
Thank you, Raymond. Equivalence, not equivocation.
How can we explain this? There are two ways. One is ignorance. People just don't know the truth about communism. The second is willful blindness. People know the truth, but choose to ignore it because the truth about communism's horrors is too painful to confront. Given the sad state of our educational system, we can assume most people fall into the first category. They just don't know. So let me offer some facts. But before I do, I need to address another question. Why is it important that everyone know what communism did? Here are 3 reasons. First,
I just want to stop and address the point about the education system. The famous American or Western education system that's pro-communist. Definitely not a country where during the Red Scare you were fired for being a communist professor, or were black or tanky professors like Michael Parenti were blackballed from academia for years and years for saying anything in the support, in support of existing socialism, which, by the way, are authoritarian, anti-freedom policies in a so-called capitalist, liberal bourgeois democracy. So again, all these accusations against communism are just projection. But Carlos, you work in education. Do you have anything to add there?
Yes. The only thing I agree with what he said was that the state of our education is sad. It is sad, but it's not sad like you said because everyone's a communist. Because that's not that's not even close to being the case. Like the opposite is. It's sad precisely because the opposite is the case. Because what dominates the purpose of education is not education, is creating conditions so that you can profit off of education, putting millions and millions of people in insurmountable debt. Will they'll be not able to pay it off ever in their life, right? Because they wanted to get an education, and creating conditions so that teachers are underpaid and students are just not in a culture where learning is the purpose of why they're in class. As I mentioned in the last stream I was on, the goal of education is to create people who are smart enough to work the task capitalism needs, but dumb enough to question the existing order. That's how education is structured. And that's why it's sad. It's not sad because they're promoting communism or hiding the legacy of communism, but because it's capitalist in nature, it's bourgeois in nature. And right now we have in the Midwestern Marx Publishing Press, one of the books that we're editing with one of our authors is about the role of neoliberalism since post-World War II in education and the effects that has had through standardized testing and all these other different mechanisms that have just completely corrupted what education is about. So education is sad, but not because of the opposite reasons of why he's saying it's sad.
And we have a sort of laboratory or experiment in the U.S. itself, and I bring this up a lot because I have a lot of friends from Louisiana who experienced this firsthand. But in Louisiana, they had a very, or at least a decent public school system, a more socialistic or social way of doing education. And after a lot of those schools were wiped out by Hurricane Katrina, Milton Friedman writes an op-ed to George Bush saying to make, all of these private, or make them all, private charter schools. So as Carlos said, a move to make more money off of education, to maximize the amount of money that capitalists and shareholders can make off of the education system. And, now there are tons of high schools in Louisiana where you got to pay like $20,000 to $40,000 a year in high school tuition versus, the inner city schools or the schools in poorer areas. Public schools have become completely run down. And Louisiana is now like 48th or 49th in the country in education. And, we're not even a good country in terms of education at all. A country who is China, a socialist country. So, objectively, these PragerU arguments make no sense.
we have a moral obligation to the victims of communism not to forget them. Just as Americans have a moral obligation to remember the victims of slavery, we have the same obligation to the billion victims of communism, especially the 100 million who were murdered. Second,
that's interesting that he does say Americans need to confront slavery. So he does place the deaths or blame those deaths on a mode of production, the mode of production, slavery, which turned into capitalism. But then he doesn't talk about the deaths of the Iraq War, the deaths of starvation, or the deaths in the American prison system, or any of the deaths that are caused by capitalism. So it's any mode of production, really. They can look any past mode of production or any mode of production other than one that doesn't enrich them. They can say the deaths that happen under that mode of production, we attribute to that, and all the horrific things and all the horrific exploitation under that mode of production, we attribute to that. But anything like that happens under the capitalist mode of production, the slavery that still exists, that's still widespread under global capitalism, don't worry about that, because it enriches people. So it's all sick and cool and moral.
It also forgets that his example of slavery was absolutely essential for the development of Northern capitalism in the U.S. and of European capitalism. Like, come on, man! It's the same system. Like, the mode of production of slavery is different, but it's sustained within the epoch of capitalism as the precondition for industrial capital. And for capitalism,
like, if you want to know the level of collaboration, the capitalists weren't just buying cotton from the slave markets. The bankers in capitalist Europe and the capitalist North were financing the plantations and the plantations expansion and the expansion of adventurers, which were basically private armies who would go and kill people and clear off more lands and conquer more lands for the slave plantations. That was all funded and supported by the capitalists. So, okay, did I cut you off?
No, I agree.
Sorry, I wanted to jump in. I wrote an article about that a while back. It's one of my favorite things that I've written. We talked about it on the stream before, but
mine too. It's one of my favorite things you've written. But yeah, I was done. That's why I was shaking my head.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
The best way to prevent an evil from reoccurring is to confront it in all its horror. The fact that many people today, especially young people, mention communism as a viable option for modern society proves they don't know communism's moral record. Therefore,
I just want to say cope. I love when they just get, young people are talking about communism again. Like, they're really stupid, right? You can tell they're nervous.
Oh my God. And it reminds me of this one story. I forget where I read it, but they had sent the intelligence agency before the CIA. I forget what it's called. But they had sent someone to the Communist Party as a spy. And and the person ended up leaving the agency because once he found out what communism was, he joined the communists. So the worst thing that can happen for these Prager fucks is for people to actually find out the history of communism and what communism is.
For sure. It's like the American soldiers who defected to Korea during the Korean War and Vietnam during the Vietnam War, because they were like, oh, these guys are right. Capitalism is murderous and imperialist. Communism's pretty sweet.
or they do not properly fear communism, which means this evil could happen again. And why could it happen again? That brings us to reason number 3. The leaders of communist regimes and the vast number of people who help those leaders torture, enslave, and murder were nearly all normal people. Of course, some were psychopaths, but most were not, which means that any society, including free ones, can devolve into communism or some analogous evil. Now, some facts.
What's interesting, if you talk to any rich people, and I think this has also been proven, like academically in peer-reviewed studies, is like the people who succeed in business are very likely to be like sociopaths. Instead of being serial killers, though, they just become cutthroat in the business world. I talked to someone recently who's a salesman. He's like, you would be shocked. I don't even know if he knows I'm a communist, but he was telling me, like, you would be shocked how many of the richest people in the world at the top, these CEOs are just psychopaths, and they're terrible people, in their personal lives too, because they've learned to just not care about anyone but themselves. Versus, even now, when you can look at even the USSR documents that were classified that the party didn't want getting out. The stuff Stalin and the party higher ups were saying, wasn't horrific stuff. They were trying to construct socialism. They were trying to do things in a way that benefited their people the most. It wasn't just this evil cabal of psychopaths running the country. Even though some of the CIA members thought that's what they were going to find with the dissolution of the USSR, when a lot of those inner documents got released, they're like, oh, they weren't evil. They were trying to build socialism. And then, he talks about communism enslaving and torturing people. The U.S. tortured people so that they could invade Iraq and kill millions of people. They destroyed the country of Libya, one of the most prosperous countries in Africa, because of years of socialist development, turned it into a country that had an open-air slave market. Capitalism brings destruction and slavery. Communism brings construction and brings an end to slavery. Cuba, another example there.
Yeah, we're in dark times, and sometimes it's difficult to find hope for the socialist project. I think that whenever you feel down, when you go on social media and you see a bunch of people who should be allying together, just bickering about nonsense and not organizing workers, whenever you feel down and hopeless about socialism, put a PragerU video on. Because nothing will give you more fucking hope than these rich motherfuckers telling you consistently how possible communism is, especially in America. So, I mean, this is like a motivational video at this point. I mean, I don't know. It's great. If they think we can do it, why don't we?
True. That's true. They're telling us we need to be scared of this thing. It's something that can spread, even in a free society like America. And yeah, I've always said, like, the more successful a country is in building socialism and combating imperialism, the more imperialism will lie about that country. Right? The reason we think the DPRK is so crazy is because the U.S. has put so much time, effort, and money into destroying them, but they've been unable to. So they just, the propaganda has been raging for years, and they do the same thing with Marxism. They're okay with social democracy. They don't like Bernie. They don't want him being the president, but they'll let him run his campaign and do his thing. But you start talking about communism and Marxism, and the alarm bells go off for these guys. So yeah, great point. This is like that commie motivation right now.
Based on the authoritative Black Book of Communism, written
Authoritative
by 6 French scholars and published in the United States by Harvard University Press. Here are the numbers of people murdered by communist regimes, not soldiers, ordinary civilians. Vietnam, 1 million. Eastern.
I mean, I guess he's saying not soldiers, but if he's pulling from the Black Book of Communism, I'm pretty sure they admittedly use like death tolls from World War II in their death count, including countries who are fighting the Nazis. And then the writers of this book have said that it's not true. He said it's an authoritative source. One of those people who wrote this book said, no, the other guys were just obsessed with tallying the death count as high as they could, and one of them was obsessed with reaching the number 100 million or something. He wanted to hit the specific number, so they were inventing deaths out of thin air. The authors of this book, which Dennis Prager just told us is authoritative in academia.
One of the sources is a conversation that Churchill had with Stalin, where he asked him, how many people have you killed? And Stalin was like, and Churchill said 10 million. Real scholars, these guys, huh?
Genius. That's one of my favorite Parenti quotes, black shirts and reds. Stalin's like, whoa, man. Churchill's like, 10 million. Black Book of that's in the Black Book of Communism is a cited source.
If you look at the footnote, it's got like the first ever emoji, and it's Stalin going like this. Which pictures that people put.
Europe, 1 million. Ethiopia, 1.5 million. North Korea, 2 million. Cambodia, 2 million. The Soviet Union, 20 million. China, 65 million. And the numbers are conservative.
And in some of these places like Vietnam and North Korea, the U.S. bombing campaigns in Cambodia, the U.S. bombs, the imperialist capitalist bombs killed more people than they're even accusing communism of killing. These countries that we invaded to stop the spread of communism, because apparently communism is so evil and dangerous and it's the worst thing ever because it killed 1 million people in Vietnam, when the U.S. war in Vietnam killed like an estimated 3 million people. So what the hell, even by your own made up statistics, capitalism's still worse.
Absolutely. Oh my God. North Korea, like it got to the point where the pilots were like, we can't bomb anything anymore because all the buildings are just done. Like, what do we bomb? And they're like, oh, keep bombing. It's so ridiculous. Like you said, in a lot of these places, the death tolls of imperialism are so much higher, even if you accept these bullshit numbers. But there's nuances. Like, for instance, China, a lot of those numbers come from the period of the Great Leap Forward. And what scholars on China have shown, people like Carlos Martinez and other folks, is that the death tolls per 10,000 in China were the same as anywhere else in the underdeveloped world that was kept underdeveloped because of imperialism and colonialism. So it's not a unique death toll of communism. It's the death tolls that result from poverty and malnutrition that's created by centuries of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism. So in those years where China had high death tolls, their high death tolls were like the ones in India, which they are only seen as higher because socialism had done such a good job at bringing them down for the 15 or so years in which no for the 5-6 years in which the PRC existed before the sort of death toll started rising. So it's completely, it's reifying facts, like completely taking them out of their historical context in order to then amplify it, because India had the same death tolls and it wasn't socialist.
Right, and the way they try to make those numbers also come from extrapolation too. Like even in China, they admit they don't know exactly how many people died. And I believe Deng Xiaoping, who was carrying out an ideological campaign against Mao at the time, trying to take, you know, advance his own line in the party. He said it was like 18,000 people died at that time or something. I don't know. So these numbers are also wildly extrapolated. And just another comment on the Korean War. Most of the statistics that we have about the Korean War, like the 15 to 20% of them being killed, or of the population being killed, or every building over 2 stories tall being leveled, most of these come from American Air Force pilots, right? We don't even have statistics at the time because in China and Korea and underdeveloped countries, they didn't have record keeping and on the level that they needed in order to know how many people actually died during the Great Leap Forward or how many people died during the war. But in the Korean War, it was literally just like Curtis LeMay saying, I think 20% of their population, or like Carlos said, they were literally coming back and saying, there's nothing left to bomb. What do you even want us to do? We've already bombed every building and all the infrastructure. So, yeah, just a terrible little anecdote there.
And of course, these numbers do not describe the suffering endured by hundreds of millions of people who were not murdered. The systematic stripping people of their right to speak freely, to worship freely, to start a business, or even to travel without party permission. No non-communist judiciary or media. The poverty of nearly all communist countries, the imprisonment of vast numbers of people, and of course, the trauma suffered by the hundreds of millions of friends and relatives of the murdered and imprisoned. These numbers don't tell you about the frozen millions in the vast Soviet Siberian prison camp system known as the Gulag Archipelago, or the Vietnamese communists' route.
Do you remember that country that's got 4% of the population and 25% of the world's Gulag members? You remember that communist country? What's that communist country's name?
Was that the Soviet Union or is that the United States?
It's the United States.
Oh,
Yeah.
see, I thought they were a capitalist.
Yeah. It's the communist hellhole where 25% of the world's prisoners are in.
Well, they don't have don't have like slave labor like the USSR though, do they? They don't make people
No.
work in the prisons.
No, of course not. That's why it's only billions and billions of dollars that are produced by labor that's paid cents for an hour's worth of work, right? That's not slavery at all, and it's not at all in the amendment that supposedly freed slavery, which still said that, well, if people slavery is illegal with the exception of it as a punishment, right? So it's definitely not a capitalist country, though.
Definitely not. And they definitely don't purposefully keep the minimum wage so that it doesn't apply to prisoners, so that they can continue to use them like slaves. That's something that you would only see in the Soviet gulags, not in a capitalist freedom country like the U.S. And I also think it's interesting, speaking of how free capitalist countries are. It's interesting to hear these propagandists talk about censorship of freedom of speech, and that's why we can't have communism. When you have the Biden administration right now literally trying to create a disinformation board to censor people to save democracy, completely inverting the idea of democracy in increasing autocratic censorship, which the U.S. State Department has such a long history of, especially during the Red Scare, basically rooting any communists out of Hollywood. And that's not even to mention the dictators they put in power all over the world, the Pinochets of the world, who have massacred and tortured leftists for being leftists, with kill lists literally given to them by the CIA. But that's not censorship of freedom of speech. As long as it's corporations doing it instead of the government, then it's freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're absolutely right.
Routine practice of burying peasants alive to terrorize other peasants into supporting the communists, or Mao Zedong's regular use of hideous tortures to punish opponents and intimidate peasants. People associate evil with darkness. That's not accurate. It is easy to look into the dark. It is very hard to stare into bright light. One should therefore associate evil with extreme brightness, given that people rarely look at real evil.
That's weird. He wants to associate evil with extreme brightness. Maybe he means, like, by extreme brightness, he means the Shining Path in Peru. Because, like, them and Pol Pot are, like, the only communist groups I can think of that, like, terrorize peasants who wouldn't support them. And we know Pol Pot was CIA backed. Shining Path very well might have been as well. But yeah.
He was trying to get his poet points up there, and I don't think it worked.
I think it's people always say, like, you need to stare into the darkness and realize that anybody could become Hitler or Stalin. It's like, no, those are specific material conditions and totally different people. And, it had something to do with their personal psychology and makeup. But I don't know. Not anybody could become Hitler tomorrow or Stalin.
Yeah. Oh, man. I'm glad the video's almost done, because this is torturous. The inspirational part, we're well past it now.
I'm running out of energy. I need more inspiration, Dennis.
We gotta make a clip of all the places where they talk about how possible communism is, and then just watch that.
We should just edit that together and say, like, PragerU communism pump up. Put inspirational music behind it.
They're teaching
not
communism.
confront real evil.
What were you saying?
No, I was just joking with the motivational video. They're teaching communism to you. It's just a long video filled with clips of them talking about how your kids are indoctrinated and stuff. It would be great.
Often make up evils, like systemic racism in 21st century America, or toxic masculinity, or patriarchy, that are much easier to confront. The Book of Psalms states, "Those of you who love God must hate evil." If you don't believe in God, here's another way of putting it. Those of you who love people must hate evil. If you don't hate communism, you don't care about, much less love, people. I'm Dennis Prager.
They literally just reversed plagiarized Fred Hampton, who said, "Socialism is the people. If you hate socialism, you hate the people."
Uh-huh. And I've my father read the Bible to me pretty much every day growing up, and the principles of Christianity are way more compatible with socialism than they are with capitalism. Jesus goes into the temple and beats up the merchants who are in there selling things in the church. He talks about love thy neighbor, and obviously capitalism's based on expansion and exploitation. But it's like when I hear people like this, what kind of makes me mad too is someone who did grow up in the church and actually took reading the Bible and stuff serious. Like a lot of these oligarchs who use Christianity to justify their exploitation and the capitalist mode of production, it's so obvious that they don't read the Bible or take the stuff seriously at all, and I know tons of hardworking proletarian people like my dad who do wake up before work every day and read the Bible for half an hour, and they're dedicated to this, and they live their lives with real morals. They try and treat people with respect. They don't exploit people. They would be horrified by the imperialist wars, or they are horrified by the imperialist wars of the US, because if you actually take that stuff serious and you try and take life lessons in the ancient wisdom that's scattered through the Bible, because it is in there, even if you don't think it's like a holy text that was divined by God, which we don't. But I don't know. But these people like Dennis Prager, they don't take it serious. They're just trying to indoctrinate good, hardworking people who do use religion as a source of community, or do have spiritual connection, and use it to indoctrinate these people. Use it to get these people to go against their own interests politically, go against their own interests economically. And thankfully, my family woke up from that BS a while ago. But I have other family members, unfortunately, and I still love them very, very much. But they've gone to see Dennis Prager talk, and they thought he's saying a lot of great things. And these are people who I know they'd give you the shirt off their back if they saw you were struggling. Yet they support capitalism, a system leaving everyone in poverty, and it's because people like Dennis Prager manipulate religion and use it to hurt people who actually have principled beliefs in favor of helping people.
Yeah, religion has always been a double-edged sword, and that the Marxist sociological analysis of religion has always reflected that. On one hand, it's used to keep people dormant or to promote bourgeois ideology, and the church, especially early on, was one of the played a really big role in the development of capitalism. But on the other hand, the early Christianity, they were basically living in ascetic or poor communism, right? They were basically in like the Cultural Revolution in China, right? And Marx was this one letter exchange where they ask him, where has communism worked? And he's like, look at the letters of St. Paul. There's definitely a socialist, one of the first more militant socialistic workers movement in England, the Charters, they were Christian. A lot of the socialist experiments and the utopian communities that took place in the 19th century in the US, they were based on Christian and Catholic principles. The early Christian theorists like St. Thomas, St. Augustine, look at how he talks about properties, communal property, man, that's communism. And even Aquinas, who in his attempt to combine Aristotle with Christian doctrine, he also gives way to some more openness that are he legitimizes some activities so that the church doesn't become incompatible with some of the developments of capitalism. But even he's still held somewhat of a more socialistic approach to political economy. And all throughout the Christian religion, I don't know much about other religions, but I know that the Judeo-Christian tradition has always been closer to socialism than to anything that's preached by capitalism. And I remember I went into undergrad very dogmatically atheist. I was always trying to avoid, in our little private Catholic school, I was trying to avoid the mandatory religion class that they would have us take. So I left it up to my last semester And I remember I read this book by Father Hayes or some, I forget his name, but it was like an introduction into Catholicism, and he used the imagery of the snake, and the way that he was describing the snake was as greed. And um, I saw that, holy shit, even the theology is like very compatible with socialism. Obviously, I think, I think, no, we are materialists. I don't think that um, at its philosophical core, Marxism is compatible with some of the claims made by religion. But sociologically, I think that, you know, we're definitely allies in the struggle for a people-oriented form of society, and that's been the case in Latin America and the U.S. and pretty much everywhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely the religion's incompatible if you take it as a whole, if you take it in its totality, you know, in a sort of fundamentalist way. But kind of what I was talking about earlier with, you know, there being ancient wisdom scattered in these religious texts, even if you don't believe the religious texts in their totality. Like what my dad would always make me read in his favorite was the Proverbs. And, you know, Proverbs are basically just like wisdom for life, you know, ways to live your life in a way that's moral, in a way that's intelligent as well. You know, it's materialist in that way. You know, it's based on practice. So yeah, there's also, and you know, then religious fundamentalists will be like, "Oh, you're picking and choosing," and I'll be like, "Yes, I am. I'm picking and choosing what's not dumb." Sorry. All right. Well, Carlos, you have anything else you want to talk about or promote here? We've been going for about 2.5 hours, so it's always a pleasure to hang out with you and watch some videos and talk to our audience.
Absolutely, brother. The only thing I think the only thing I'd promote is our recently published book. We just hit a month since we published it. It's called "Reading the Classical Texts of Marxism" by Thomas Riggins. He's our counseling editor. He's a retired philosophy professor who has taught for 60 plus years and is also a member of the Communist Party. Before that, he was in the Socialist Party and the Students for a Democratic Society when it was hot in the 60s. He met a lot of famous people that we look up to now. So it's a text where he reads through the classics of Marxism, explains them, contextualizes them, which especially for the sections on science is huge, because this is someone who has been a philosopher that has also kept up with the developments of the science. So this is the sort of book that I'm recommending to everyone getting into Marxism, not just because, I mean, we publish it, but because its whole purpose is to teach people Marxism, and it's been crafted over the course of 20 years and continuously perfected. So I cannot urge enough the importance of having this book to learn Marxism, especially if you're just getting into it, or if you want to learn concerning questions about how, you know, the science has evolved since Marxism, whether it has confirmed or not confirmed dialectical materialism. I'd say pick up this book. Everyone who I've engaged with, who has read it, has really enjoyed it. So I plug that, and then we have a couple other books that we're in the process of editing right now. One of them we shared the cover photo the other day, which is on Christopher Caldwell. He's a British communist, one of the better Marxist theorists out of Britain, who died as a participant in the Spanish Civil War with the communists and the socialists there, but whose theory of art is just brilliant. And Dr. Riggins, in that text, he makes a defense of his theory of art against those who criticize it, both from the left and from circles that are hostile to Marxism. So check that out.
Yeah. And I'll give my own little pitch for this book too. I guess the main question I get asked is, where do I start? You know, where do I get started with reading? People like Carlos have such an expansive knowledge. You know, it seems like a tall task. Start with this, because like we were talking about earlier, if you go to university, they're not going to give you Lenin, Marx, and Engels. They're going to give you a bunch of psychoanalytical neo-Marxist thinkers. But those classic texts are still super relevant, and they're super important, probably the most important for building your foundation. So here you have, someone with a long history of teaching in an academic setting, teaching the classical texts of Marxism that usually aren't taught in academia, and really laying it out in a way that makes it easier to understand, contextualizes it, and then updates it for modern day, which is so important. So yeah, I think this is one of probably the most important thing we've published, I guess. I also am partial to the Journal of American Socialist Studies, but if you're just starting out with Marxism, please get this. And I know I've had tons of people ask me, where should I start? Here's where you should start, with our comrade and mentor in many ways, Thomas Reagan.
And it's got so much labor behind it. Like the writing process took 2 decades, plus the experience that he had to accumulate in order to write it, and the editing process took months from all of us working together. And you and me wrote a preface for it, which I've heard really good things about from those who have read it. And it's also at a very affordable price, which you don't find with new books. I mean, look at the Marx Engels Marxism series in Palgrave. The cheapest books are $65, and that's a really cheap series. Most new books are at $120 something, $130. And as an academic who has to engage with new materials, it's very tough for me to do so. Having to ask people, like, can I get a free book if I do a book review sort of thing? So the book is just $20, and it's got a whole lot of labor behind it, and it's really going to help you if you read it. And it's 426 pages, I think. So it's a big book. It's something that you're going to take your time with it if you read it front to back, and it's definitely going to be helpful.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your support. Thank you for the super chats, and just the likes, subscribes, comments, supports. Thank you just for being here. Educate, organize, agitate, and solidarity. Yeah, thank you all for your support. See you, Carlos.
See you, brother.